I think we should be live now. Thank you everyone that's out there for joining us. My name is Carlos Aguilar. I'm a film critic here in Los Angeles. And it's my pleasure to be moderating tonight's Q&A with director Adriana Bosch and historian Lillian Guerra about the film Letters to Eloisa. Thank you for being with us, Adriana.
Thank you, Carlos, for hosting this, and Lillian for joining me.
So as people processing the documentary that we watch, you want to tell us, I think it's very interesting, your decision of using the letters themselves and having this great writer and poet speak in the first person and sort of like using these small moments of reenactment or dramatizations of his life and, having him speak in first person. Can you tell us, where did that decision come from? Why did you feel that that was sort of the style to approach this figure?
Well, it began with the letters. Essentially, I read these letters when I was finishing a documentary on Fidel Castro in, I think it was 2015. So that was 05? 05. Oh my God, 05. That many years ago. So I ran into these letters and I started reading them. So the letters didn't get added as a stylistic device. The documentary grew out of these letters that I thought were really an unusual window into a regime and into a culture and into a process that has been kept close. It's very hard to break into the day-to-day of what happened in Cuba. And it's not every day that you find a body of document that speaks firsthand about it. Also, legitimacy is very important. To have a voice that is there, that expresses, in dramatic terms, in details, what it is that is happening to the individual in these circumstances, I thought was an opportunity I couldn't pass up. So
tell us a bit about the research process of, as I was telling you before, I'm sort of ashamed and, regretful that I know very little about Jose Lezama and sort of his career and his work. And, why do you think that, there hasn't been a documentary or a film about him before you decided to approach it?
Well, there are a few reasons to that. Number one, Lezama was never a writer of majorities. He was a writer of minorities. And when he actually went out into the world and into the limelight of literature and of, celebrity literature, if you want to call it that, during the Latin American boom, he was ostracized. He was not allowed to bathe in the limelight that some of the other writers bathe in. So as a mediatic event, as a media event, which it was, the Latin American boom was part of that, Lezama did not participate on it. So he remained a writer who'd written a great novel, who, was a literary figure, but there was no place that you could go and find him in his sort of, celebrity moment. And that makes it really hard for people to know, whether it's a literary person, whether it's an artist, whether it's anyone. If you miss that moment of celebrity where you belong, then it's very hard to retool and shine a light on this figure. I think that had a lot to do with the fact that nobody really heard about Lezama, because his novel, everybody says, well, his novel is so difficult. I'm not a literary person. I'm a political writer. I make political documentaries. I make all kinds of other documentaries. I never made a literature documentary. I know how to read, but I understood it right away in its, maybe not its details, but certainly its main message and its in its projection. So that's why I think it was so hard to rescue. It's always hard to rescue people, but when you're rescuing people from obscurity, it's even harder.
Right. In that sense, you have also a lot of experts and people that knew Lezama firsthand in the documentary. Tell us about how, someone like Lillian and, other experts in the film helped you and the story be contextualized in terms of the significance of Lezama and the broader spectrum of Cuban identity in the 20th century?
Well, I think Lillian made a huge contribution to the documentary. Other people did too. But the essential thing that I wanted to do is I wanted to do a documentary that bridged Cuba and the exile community. I didn't want to make a documentary that spoke only from the point of view of us on this side, looking at Cuba on the other side. So I went into Cuba and I got some interviews with half a dozen people that knew Lezama or that studied Lezama, and they were all incredibly passionate and incredibly close to him. And I took those interviews and kept them. And then I used them in the documentary years later. Those interviews really date to 2013, when there was an opening, a window of opening for scholars and filmmakers to go into Cuba and do all kinds of things. And there was also a window in the discussion, in the narrative of the revolution, that these people could actually share these things with you within their own limitations, but enough so that you got a sense of this being an authentic and genuine story that was not really painted or, with a political brush from the outside, but had its roots on the inside. The contextualizing of the story in an hour, to be able to carry all those many threads, all those many lines in an hour is very hard. So you have to count with historians that basically know everything and can synthesize it for you and give you that moment that is indispensable in a film, but that you have to get through it very quickly so you can get on with the true drama of the film, which is your character and what he's going through and how he's writing about it and etc. So, in that sense, historians become indispensable, as do literary experts and everybody else like that. But, the heart of the documentary really was Lezama and the letters and what he went through. But, maybe, yeah.
Lillian, do you wanna add something to what
Sure, I would say, it's interesting to me is that I went to Cuba for the first time in 1995. I have been back to Cuba more than 50 times. I spent a year in Cuba from 1996 to 1997 doing my dissertation research. And why did I sort of mesh with my generation of intellectuals in Cuba, young people, because I was in my 20s at that time? Well, because I had read the greats of the Latin American boom. And I was somebody who had read Lezama Lima's book at Dartmouth College, taught by a guy who was a Peruvian refugee from Sendero Luminoso, and who taught at Dartmouth College and who had tremendous connections to the Latin American left. He was one of my mentors. He was the mentor of my thesis in Spanish. I did 2 majors. And to make a long story short, he told me that I could not get away with thinking that I would know what was the Latin American boom if I hadn't read not only sort of the known books in the United States, but I needed to read Lezama Lima. And I needed to engage that history. This is long before, I go to do my doctorate. This is like 1989, 1990. So when I went to Cuba, what was so interesting to me is that, the early years of those visits, the long year that I spent there, which is 13 months doing my dissertation research, the connection that I would often make to my my counterparts of my generation at the National Archive, at the University of Havana, et cetera, and to a certain extent, these connections have like the ability to make connections have diminished. That was a moment of opening. To make a long story short, I made those connections in part because I knew the literature that had been censored. And I knew who Lezama Lima was. And I also knew who Reinaldo Arenas was, who was, by his own identification, like a student Lezama Lima. And so that kind of gave me this cachet. And because, you know, Lezama Lima's work, that particular book is, you know, the last book, right? The Paradiso is a book that is a culmination of a body of work. It helped to not be in literature. It helped to be a historian, because I knew who he was long before he did that book. So in Cuba, I think one of the important points to not miss is that Lezama Lima is somebody who was revered by those who should have shunned him, who were my generation, you know, los hombres nuevos, and we don't say it, but las mujeres nuevas, you know, people who were born in the late 60s, early 70s, right when he was being the most repressed and the most well-known abroad. And then who grew up sort of with this guy in the background. And when they had the chance to read his stuff in the late 80s, early 90s, they didn't just take advantage. They read it as if it was a sacred text, you know, something that would reveal what their parents hadn't been able to tell them. Because, you know, this is a revolution that not only censored, that not only eliminated the autonomy of civil society and the University of Havana, and you couldn't have a chess club unless it was approved by your Committee for the Defense of the Revolution. It wasn't just that. It was a society where your parents were so fearful that they could negatively impact your future simply by explaining something to you, like Lezama Lima, or, you know, what was the historical scenario in which they had themselves become adults in the 1960s, that my kids, my people, my generation grew up with really this tremendous mission to figure out who they were based on this silent script, you know, the recognition that it existed, this thing that had yet to be really fully developed, this narrative. It's not a script, it's a narrative that was their parents' experience, the pure experience of the 60s and the 70s. And so hence, when, you know, when Adriana asked me to be part of the project, it was so easy. I mean, for me, immediately, it seemed like, of course, you know, of course.
Right. You were, I remember you were jealous that I had those letters.
Yeah.
But, you know, the problem with these historians is that, you know, you have an edit room, and that's great. But I think Lillian's contribution was invaluable to the show.
Adriana, I wanted to ask you, you know, for you as a filmmaker, as a creator, you know, part of the, what you do is engage with your audience, you know, through these Q&A like this, or going to festivals, you know, and that was something that was denied to Lezama by not being able to travel abroad to engage with people that were reading him, with, you know, scholars that were kind of praising him. So to that extent, how do you feel like that affected, you know, his legacy and sort of the way that the outside world understands or doesn't understand his work?
I think there's one of my great friends who was in the documentary said that when he teaches literature, he likes to show the faces of people, because otherwise it's just words. And I think there is always a connection that a filmmaker has with a documentary that is only ultimately revealed in conversation. Mm-hmm. And you try to put your essence and your intention and everything that you think into the piece itself. And that's not an easy thing to do. But it is when you look at people's faces, when you realize how they're reacting, it inspires you, and essentially it gives the piece a different and a longer life. And also, I, for one, as I begin to think about how the questions people are going to have, how people are going to react to the documentary, it gives me a real sense of what is the meaning of this? What is it that somebody watching this is going to get? What's the essence of what I'm trying to convey? And also, how does it fit into their moment, their lives? In the case of Letters to Eloisa, which began really truly as a meditation, always was, on the weight of an authoritarian regime on the soul of a human being. And I carry that like a torch, or you know, or you could say, oh, and also like a flashlight, as I made this documentary. This is what I am looking for. This is my focus. And you come on the other side of it, and all of a sudden, this debate, this, you know, it's very, very present in society today. I mean, you have all the autocrats that are rising. You have all, you know, all the people and all, you know, the governments that are suspending the rights of journalists, the whole notion of fake truth, the notion of, you know, of curtailing people's ability, people's freedom of expression, people's sexual freedom, and everything else popping up all over the world, even in our own lives. And you're sitting on this story and you're thinking, as you look at your audiences, that's what this has to mean, because that's what I intended to do. And somehow, because history works in that way, we are no longer in a time of democracy, where democracy is shining bright and taking over the world. We are in a time of retreat from democracy. And this film hits precisely on that. This is what happens.
May I add here that one of the great lessons of Adriana's film is the fact that he was famous. Lezama Lima was not just, you know, internationally renowned as he is being his.
Cuba, he was very well known.
He is famous. So one says, as those folks who surrounded him in Cuba and who were his admirers, even if they ended up being complicit with the system that repressed him, they recognized, and I believe it is important that we recognize, that, my goodness, for every Lezama Lima in Cuba, if he was only one and he was unique, how many other Lezama Limas might have been produced, you know, in Cuba, had they read his work
in the
world, right? Not just in Cuba, right? Yeah. But he was not allowed, his voice was not allowed to be heard. And so locally, you know, he was not just shunned socially, he was censored and shunned literally, you know, and nobody could really reference his work. They couldn't launch their own work from that fabulous example. I mean, they couldn't reference it. So you can imagine abroad as well how this was very, like, his work, which should have been such an extraordinary contribution to the world of letters, was restricted in what it could have inspired, precisely because he himself was sofocado. I mean, he was asphyxiated, you know, in Cuba. And one has to say, because we also have to speak for the many other people who are, like, you know, 30 years younger or 50 years younger than Lezama Lima in the late 60s and the 70s, and who end up in labor camps because they're accused of ideological diversionism. They're accused of doubt. I mean, according to Raul Castro, who defined this spectrum of this legal spectrum of sanctionable counter-revolutionary attitudes in 1968, you know, doubt was the worst. That's somebody who purports to be a revolutionary and who, in the end, questions because they think, according to Raul Castro and this written down set of reglas, you know, like the criteria by which you judge somebody as an ideological diversionist. You know, doubt is not just somebody who questions, but somebody who invites others to question.
And in that sense, do you feel like is there anything to reconcile by the fact that because of the revolution, he was able to publish this book, but also because of the revolution, he wasn't allowed to publish anymore? So it was sort of like a very strange, you know, crucible that the whole situation.
Absolutely. I think that there is nothing in this story or in any story that is only one way. I think that he writes this letter to his sister where he says, when else could I have published a book written that is 600 pages long? Maybe, maybe not. I think that's, you know, maybe somebody would have published it, maybe they would not have published it. But the fact that there was a cultural renaissance in Cuba and that there was a great opening for people to use the presses to work without having to work in something else. I think you have to be, in a sense, you understand the power of that if this is what you do. What if you're a writer? I mean, and what if you're a filmmaker and you can't make your films? You have to work like Lezama did before the revolution as a lawyer in one of Cuba's prisons. Your time is limited. So the revolution did something wonderful, which is gave writers time and the means to do what they do, to be producers of culture. But then that comes at a price, and the price is that you have to produce the culture that the revolution wants you to produce. And when you don't, then you're no longer of service to the revolution. And I think, in a sense, that catch-22 became the story of Lezama Lima. He loved this idea that he could now spend all his time writing and producing what he, writing and editing the books that he thought people should read, that he would contribute to this democratization of culture, which is such a powerful, powerful idea. Even now, you see people, I mean, you look at what's happening in the United States with some organizations and all kinds of things like that, and you see this idea that culture can be democratized, that people can read the classics even if they don't go to elite schools, even if they don't go to school, that you bring the classics to them. And that's such a powerful idea. And this is, I think, what drove a lot of these writers to actually love, and certainly Lezama, what he was doing. He could finally do what he could do and not have to do something else in the meantime. But that comes at a price, and and that's it.
We have a question from the audience. It says the film is so beautiful, tragic, nostalgic. It tells the tale of a land of the past so well. It's very well told, this documentary, in a narrative sense. I admit I didn't know anything about Lezama, but after today, I get the sense that I need to read his works. How much time did it take you to do all this research? What repercussion did Lezama's passing brought down to Fidel's Cuba as viewed by the rest of the world?
Well, I had the privilege of not getting this film funded for 10 years. So, I could keep at it and I could keep at it. I was doing a million other things. I was doing Latin Music USA 4-hour series, Latino American 6-hour series. Then I did a film about William Morgan, the soldier of fortune. Now Hollywood is going to make a feature film. We'll see how they do. Maybe they'll go have chimichangas on 8th Street, like, the Fockers did. But it gave me an opportunity, I think a unique opportunity, to actually really get to know the character, to really read all the letters, to know all the different elements that went into the story, to find out where it intersected with the context. And to try to create a framework with the letters that was, and Paradiso, remember Paradiso, there is a literature. This piece has biography. This piece has context. Thank you, Lillian, and others, but mostly Lillian for that. This piece has literature, and this piece has the letters tracing the decline, the arc of the rise and decline of a person through Cuban history. And it gave me an opportunity to simplify the story and still try to get all those elements out there. But the heart of this, I think, and I've seen it in the audiences, and not just, I had a great screening in Miami, which is, you take that for granted that people are going to get emotional. But so many people have had an emotional reaction to this film, even if they don't know who this character is. And ultimately, that's what a filmmaker wants. You want people to empathize, to feel, to recognize themselves, their present, their lives, and to question how it is that they see, how they see the world, and to understand. My real objective is for people to understand that there is no left or right when it comes to these things, that that there is only freedom and authority, and that ultimately, then there is good and evil, and that ultimately you've got to understand that it doesn't matter where it comes from. It can come from the right, left and it can come from the right. Authoritarianism is bad. And
Right.
and that is exact my it doesn't matter who you are. This is what happened to a poet, and you have to feel for this human being. And
we
that
have to sorry, we have to wrap up, but before we do that, I do think that it's important for Adriana or Lillian to sort of briefly mention Lezama's importance as a homosexual man in Cuba, and how Paradiso sort of became this bastion of, I mean, I'm sure that is very hard to summarize that, but the film, even when she's mentioned in Strawberry and Chocolate, the only Cuban film ever nominated for an Oscar, his relevance, for the gay community, I'm assuming must be still very important today.
Well, let me start that, and then I'll hand it over to Lillian. I think that, as you see, I dropped one storyline out of the many, but homophobia and homoeroticism and Lezama's life were all intertwined. And he was a lifelong closeted homosexual. When the revolution comes, that, he continues to be a life closeted homosexual, but it becomes very difficult to be, because there is no longer the ability to live a secret life is no longer possible. You have to live a life that is responsive and open to the society. And for Lezama, Paradiso was two things. And it was you, Lillian, who gave me that wonderful line in the film that says that he's coming out. The only way that he could come out, through literature. And, and he had to, because he'd been repressed for so long. And here was his opportunity. And yet it comes at a time of extreme homophobia in Cuba. And that, I think, is something that undermines him and puts him in a bad position for the rest of time. And I think that, Lillian, if you want to take a little bit of this on Strawberry and Chocolate and Today, I'd appreciate it, because you're so good at
you could give yourself your final thoughts before we wrap up, Lillian.
Well, I would say that the 1960s is a period in which, in fact, you see the paradox of liberation through authoritarianism played out principally in the life of the intellectual, and Lezama Lima in particular, because, my God, 3 years before Stonewall, you have a man with a major chapter in his book that is all about total freedom and total liberation of oneself through the sexual acts and emotional freedom that came from expression of true desire and truth. And where does Lezama Lima end? He is really making an argument about how truth is not relative. Truth is something that is felt. And when it is most deeply felt, it is the most true. It is the most sincere. And so this is why his legacy can't be denied. And why after the 70s, the 80s, which is both of those periods represent a kind of institutionalization and Sovietization and bureaucratization of the revolution. When you get to the early 90s, when the great filmmaker who was, since earlier than 1959 was a communist, Tomás Gutiérrez Alea, when he makes Fresa y Chocolate, Strawberry and Chocolate, he is at that moment trying to reconcile what was for him as a true leftist, as somebody who believed in socialism and total egalitarianism. He's trying to reconcile the lies, the distortions, the paradoxes, the contradictions of the revolution, the Cuban Revolution,
which has been doing his entire career.
Right.
Which has been doing his entire film career.
Exactly. He's been doing that his entire career. But what does he choose at the end of his career to express that? He chooses to use a gay character and a guy who is a young communist trying to prove himself as a communist, who is really devoted to revolutionary egalitarian values and he puts them together in this film. And then he has Lezama Lima next to Jose Marti, the great founder of anti-imperialist nationalism in Cuba. Literally can't deny it. Like it's a scene in the film, right?
Right up there. The camera pans up and says, and who is that? You know?
And he asked David, the young communist, asked the gay character, Diego, is that your dad?
Father?
Like the greatest moment ever.
I'm so sorry that we.
The film is wonderful. I mean, it's so true. It's so true.
Yeah.
We have to wrap up, but I want to thank both of you so much for this wonderful conversation, and to tell the audience that to stick around for a performance of Victoria L.A. So there's music following the movie and the conversation. So thank you, Joanna. Thank you, Lillian. It's been a wonderful time.
Carlos,
thank you so much.
Thank you.